Tonight, yeah, our speaker, we're really happy to have Dr. Annise Dobson speaking on jumping worms and forest stressors. So I'll introduce her. So Dr. Annise Dobson is the Director of Research Programs, Associate Research Scientist, and the School of the Environment at Yale University. She's highly acclaimed and productive researcher, publishing on everything in forest soil, phosphorus biogeochemistry, to our muscular mycorrhizae, to earthworms, to white-tailed deer, as well as all the interactions between all those factors using modern statistical methods such as structural equation modeling. And in the last 4 years, her work has been cited 329 times by other researchers. So she makes an impact. Studied and published with the legendary, at least in my mind, Cornell professor and deer expert, Bernd Blasi, who was a very close colleague of mine, Don Waller, at University of Wisconsin-Madison. She grew up on a farm in Ontario, Canada, and her parents still run an active nursery and native plants, and they educate local citizens about natural ecosystems through their Facebook pages and activities around Connick Pond at Cobden, Ontario. So you can check out those Facebook pages if you're interested in seeing. I checked them out and I wondered, like, why did she ever leave? It's beautiful up there. We are lucky to have with us tonight, and very fortunate, one of the leading forest health researchers in the Northeast. So please, with me, help welcome Dr. Annise Dobson.
That's a lovely introduction. It's truly an honor to be here. I'm really excited that you chose to be inside when there's so many nice plants to look at outside. All right, so as Bob mentioned, I grew up on a farm, and both sides of my family have been farmers. I'm the first one going back as far as time goes, or written records that someone in either family has not been a farmer. And one thing that you would do in farms back in the old days is you would have a bush lot that you would be a steward of the timber and of the trees in that forest. So this is a picture taken from my grandfather's bush lot, and I remember growing up, he was so proud of all of the trees and the regeneration, and he was really proud of it and show it off. He's been passed away for about 15 years, but when I went back to revisit it, instead of looking up and being really impressed with the trees, I looked down and dug a little bit of a hole. And what I loved about it, what really struck me, was this really developed organic horizon. We missed that in a lot of places. This would be very typical in a lot of forests of northeastern North America, pre-European contact, this deep organic horizon, and some of our most beloved understory, especially spring ephemeral plant traits and plant strategies, developed because of this really unique microhabitat. So maybe, does anybody have a favorite spring ephemeral or understory plant strategy that's really wacky and close to their heart? Yeah, what does trout lily do? Yeah, what does it do that you love? What does it do? It's so special.
Stores carbon in the ground.
Yeah.
For the next flowering.
Yeah. And it has another cool strategy of being able to sort of pull itself back down into the duff a little bit. So it's actually a little bit resilient to what I'm going to talk about. But yeah, so they have some cool strategies. All right, a little bit louder for the folks in the back. What are some of my favorite understory plant strategies? Well, one is that you alluded to in the title is being able to farm out a lot of the nutrient acquisition and even water acquisition to mycorrhizal fungi. So a lot of our understory plants, if you look at their roots or their understory structures, they're pretty simple. They're kind of evolved to be these powerhouses, these just like storage facilities for tons and tons of mycorrhizal fungi. And a lot of them really, really depend on it. And yeah, they're really adapted to take advantage of that. And you can see in this, there's lots of fungal hyphae, lots of fine roots, stuff like that. All right, any other favorite understory plant? Luxury consumption of nutrients. When there's a big flush, some plants can pull in extra nitrogen and then kind of store it around themselves, slowly use it up. Anyway, all sorts of things that you love, all of the plants that you love that are native understory plants, developed in this environment of having a thick organic horizon, this fluffy duff in the forest. And one of the reasons for that is that since the last glaciation, we had an ice sheet that covered this region, and we're down here just about at the extent of it. So any earthworms that were here were for the most part pushed out and have been pretty slow. In New England, we've got about 30 species, and about 5 of them are native species. But in places like New England, of course, we're experiencing global warming, but another thing that we're experiencing is global worming. And that is where about just a small subset of earthworm species that are out there, about 120 of them, are invasive into different habitats. So into temperate and tropical ecosystems. And this can look like different things in different places. So in the UK and Australia, this is displacing native earthworms that are imperiled. Around here, close to places that maybe were farmed and cultivated, that's displacing earlier invasions of the European species that I'm going to talk about a little bit. And then in probably some of those parts of New Hampshire and parts of Massachusetts as well, invading new habitats that were previously earthworm free. So you're all botanists, and so you love all of the beautiful diversity that flowers can have. Those 7,000 earthworm species do not have beautiful diversity. They all kind of look like worms. Well, some of them are pretty cool, but mostly they just look like worms. But don't let that fool you into thinking that ecologically, they're all the same. They are extremely diverse in what they eat and what they do and how they interact. And so I think that it's better to think of these earthworms as kind of like an African savanna or a field full of spring ephemerals that do have a lot of different diversity. So some of the common earthworm species that you might be familiar with. Do we have any composters in the crowd? Worm composters? Yeah, so red wigglers. These are European, but they are pretty well behaved. They don't really venture out into the forest. And so the way that you can make sure that you have these well-behaved red wigglers is that they have these yellow bands in between. So they're also called the tiger worm. Yeah, so take a look at that to make sure that you have the right earthworm species. And then the gray worm, this is a complex of different species. These you might be familiar with from them coming up onto the sidewalk during a rainstorm. They, in fact, are not coming out because their burrows get flooded. They are totally fine underwater. They're coming up because they love the damp, wet conditions. That's when they can move around easily. It's much easier to go overland when it's wet than through the soil or above when it's dry. So they just get stuck there because they can't get back down. And then the night crawler, the Canada night crawler, which is if we've got any anglers in the audience. We got one. All right, all right. So these are the classic earthworms that you use to bait a hook. And Bob did a little shout out to my dad's Facebook page, The View from Connet Pond. A lot of the pictures today are going to be from that, so it's worth following that. If you like some plant, some bird, various nature content. We also have, I mentioned, about 5 native species of earthworms. And this is going to become important later on when I talk about solutions that we're trying to the other invasive earthworms, that they are these pesky, probably very imperiled, but nobody's really looked for it, earthworms. So anything that you do, you have to be sure that you're not also impacting these ones. These are just two of the ones that are found around here. So Sparganophilus, you probably haven't seen it because it tends to be in wetlands in the saturated soil underneath the wetland. We have to be digging under a pond. Or Bimastis, the American barkworm. This one, it's possible that you would have seen it. It tends to be in coarse woody debris, so in a log, living in a decomposing log, or even on like a dying standing tree. You can sometimes find them crawl up and inside. So they don't really overlap in habitat with the common invasive earthworms. Probably haven't seen it. And they're also quite rare, certainly relative to the other species. So this is a little cartoon expanding on that first picture that I put up from my grandfather's bush lot. This is a classic New England forest historically. So all of the leaves coming down in the fall are really slow to decompose historically. There's a lot of things, a lot of arthropods, macro and micro arthropods, fungi, bacteria, but decomposition is happening relatively slowly. And so you get this buildup of very distinctive layers in the soil. And again, that supports a really diverse plant community with all of those wacky strategies that we talked about, and a whole community of other critters. When earthworms come on the scene, they take that nutrient cycling and they put the foot on the gas of it. And so everything gets mixed in, gets leached into deeper soil layers or into the water. And you see this loss of the understory plant community and loss of the understory arthropod community as well. Another metaphor for this, if you've noticed it underfoot, this is like your expensive pillow top mattress. It's got the pillow top, it's got all the layers of memory foam and very expensive. And then that one is your Harvard dorm room single mattress. It's hard, it's compact, it's just made out of one sort of 1970s foam. So that's the difference. But we're going to talk about a specific invasive worm that is a little bit more recent on the scene, and that is jumping worms. And they are a complex of, regionally, there's about 3 co-occurring species, maybe all in the genus Amenthus, maybe split between Amenthus and but they look pretty similar. We don't know a lot about the ecology between them that's different. We should, but we don't. So for the most part, I'm going to talk about them as the group of 3 that co-occur. So I'll just call them jumping worms. We know that they were introduced from East Asia in the 1940s, but they were in really, really low abundance for a long time. And it's really only the last 10, 20 loading abundance. So the jumping worm, as opposed to the night crawler, those are the 2 big worms with a little bit of colorful pigmentation that you might see, that you might compare to each other. Just a side-by-side comparison. The jumping worms can get to a really, really high density. I'll show you a little video of that early on. Whereas the night crawlers tend to be a little bit more territorial. They make these deep burrows. They can go down 2 or 3 meters. And you can see their abundance on the landscape because humans are not the only ones that leave our trash everywhere. They also leave their trash everywhere. So it's called a midden. And so I should have put a picture of this up, but anyway, they really, they take the leaf by the petiole and they sort of funnel it down and pull it down into their burrow and then eat all of the leaf tissue, leaving the veins and the petiole, and then spit that stuff back out and line their burrow with it. You can actually see how many worms are in the landscape from counting those. Jumping worms, they mature very quickly versus the night crawlers that survive like 3 to 5 years. And one other cool thing is that the night crawlers and a lot of the worms you're familiar with are going to be hermaphroditic, so they have a male. The jumping worms can have both, but more typically they're just going to have the female sex organs. So they're parthenogenetic and they don't need another worm to reproduce. And so what matters about the worms is not the worms themselves, it's what they do to the soil. You'll see as the talk goes on, they benefit some things, they're bad for other things, but I think that having a sense of what the change in soil is going to be really helpful to think about it. So this is not my grandfather's bush lot. This is one of my research field sites, but this is a soil profile. So if you've ever seen that where soil scientists will dig a pit and then look at it sort of from the side profile. So we've got the organic horizon and the A horizon and the B horizon. This is the uninvaded soil. So lots and lots of organic matter and then very stratified. When the European lumbricid earthworms come in, that's your night crawlers. That's where you get the mixing that I was talking about, the dorm mattress. That's this one here. And then with jumping worms, they're mostly living in the top, very concentrated in the top 6 inches or so. And what they do is they are voracious eaters and they deposit their castings on top of the soil so that it's really not even soil anymore. It's just pure worm poop. Has anyone seen that soil? Yeah. How would you describe it?
It washes away really easily.
It does, and makes weeding very easy. Unfortunately, it also means that it makes pulling up the native vegetation when the deer walk by very easy. But yeah, like a really easily erodible, easy to wash away. And when there's a big extreme rain event, yeah, washes away big time. Who else has seen the soil? Yeah, how would you?
I just think it's kind of horrifying how like in late summer you'll brush away a layer of leaf litter and then there's just dozens and dozens of jumping worms just like crawling all over the place, and it's just shocking like the density they occur.
I've got a video of it for those that haven't shared in your particular trauma. And then did somebody else say they'd seen the soil? Yeah, how did it strike you? You all spend a lot of time looking down, so.
It looks like coffee grounds or
Yeah.
something on top of the surface.
Yeah, so coffee grounds, that's one I've heard described. Nerds candy when you're talking to younger people, or grape nuts when you're talking to a different demographic. So they're really different than a lot of invasive species that we bring over, like beach leaf disease is one that Connecticut is really battling with right now. It showed up and within 5 years, super widespread. Jumping worms, very, very different population dynamics. They've been here possibly since 1912 with the big shipment of cherry trees for the Cherry Blossom Festival. That one's a little bit more, there's no real evidence. That one's just like, they're from this area. We brought a lot of soil from there, put it together, probably true. So that is likely, but then there's also 2 collections from the Bronx Zoo and from Albany in the 1940s. So we know they've been here at least since then, possibly earlier. And I say this not because it matters per se that they were introduced in these different places, but that you should be thinking of them as this constant introduction over and over and over from all of these different places, and that they've been pretty slow to move themselves beyond what we are doing to them. So some of my work in New York City was really interesting. Over a 5-year period, in the 1,200 plots that I had across New York City natural areas, they went from 12% of the natural areas coverage to 64%. And that was pretty shocking to the New York City Parks folks. And so they were thinking about what might have happened in that time. And there were some tree planting efforts, but the one that they thought might be the sort of most important is that Hurricane Sandy came through in that time. And there were 15,000 trees that came down. And what they did is they chipped them for biofuel, but they covered this picture over, but they collected them all in these big mulch collection piles and then distributed. And they were careful for best management practices against a lot of other things like emerald ash borer and other wood-borne pathogens and pests. But jumping worms just really weren't on the radar. So what we found is that mulch is really, really probably the number one way that jumping worms get moved around. And in fact, it is the number one way. They're pretty widespread. This is from iNaturalist. It seems to be the best coverage of it. But I know that they're much more abundant than this. They're just maybe not a priority for reporting in the different regions. Do you guys use more iNaturalist or EdMaps or IMAP invasives? Yeah.
Yeah, and also I will say that I know that there's a specific user who's bumped all of the jumping worms in our area to family level, which is maybe the reason why a lot.
Interesting. Yeah, that's actually smart because the genus is a little.
Can you kind of repeat that comment?
Here, I can repeat it. So this is the coverage might not be complete because someone in the audience knows was had a bunch of jumping worm presence submissions, but they were at the family level because the taxonomy is a little bit funky. So definitely more widespread, but the take-home message is that widespread but patchy, or yeah, kind of all over the place. Okay. So this is how you know that it's a jumping worm, because it jumps. I had the most exciting meeting of the month yesterday, or last week, with a physicist who is starting a lab in Colorado and has really high-tech cameras to take very precise slow motion videos of the jumping worm motion to try and understand how it does this really wacky behavior, what's the strategy for it, and what's the physics and the math behind it. So I'm really, really glad that he's doing that. But it's really quite unique. So there's the two things that really show you it's a jumping worm. One is the sort of leaping up into the air, and the other is the snaking across the ground. So has anybody now realized that they've seen a jumping worm after seeing this video? Yeah. Around fishing areas or just?
No, just in Framingham, Mass, just in the neighborhood.
Yeah. But here you go, that's for you. But it is exactly like you said, it is not one worm that's the problem. It's the density that they can get into. It's their ability to come in and just eat everything in the understory very, very rapidly. And another thing that's quite impressive about them is they have the ability to switch their diet quite a bit. So once they get through with the leaves, they can move on to the roots and the fungi and the organic acids and the bacteria in the soil. So they are kind of like us in many ways. They engineer their ecosystem to be just perfect for them. That thick casting layer lets them easily dive down and get away from predators or heat or cold or whatever, but they can also easily move through it. So it's like they're making perfect conditions for themselves and the worst conditions for everybody else. This is an up-close picture of what the soil looks like. And what's really important here is that it's this gravelly texture, your coffee grounds, your grape nuts, your Nerds candy. And so a lot of the seeds that are trying to germinate in this, as you can see in here, have just sort of shriveled up and died. Because this really doesn't hold moisture very well. We also talked a little bit about how easily this erodes, right? These aggregates, aggregates themselves are pretty solid, right? This is pretty hard to break up, but these don't adhere to these at all. So yeah, it's kind of like little gravel pellets. All right, so just a little snapshot of some of the easiest to explain data. With the caveat that there are lots of harder to explain patterns that we're seeing, but I'm tonight just going to cherry pick a few easy stories for you, but stay tuned for some more complicated stories. So this is some of that New York City work that I mentioned that was led by Clara Pregitzer at the Natural Areas Conservancy in New York City Parks. And they were looking at they were doing a full inventory of the natural areas. So everything from the overstory to the understory. The work is really interesting. She actually found that New York City forests are still dominated by native overstory trees. And even in the understory, it is more than 50% native species. So anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. That's an aside, but cool, very cool work. But I took some of their data. They looked at human impact. So that's just like an amalgamation of all of the things that you might measure for how humans are impacting a plant community. So proximity to roads, and playgrounds, and trash, and all sorts of things. And then I teased out just the jumping worm effect from that human impact. And then on the y-axis, this is just a really coarse measure of the percent species in this plot that are native plants. And so what we found is in the plots that had jumping worms, it was just around 10% native plants. But without jumping worms, you're up there around 25% native species in these very urban natural areas. So this is just observational, but kind of cool. And I lost my error bars on this, but yeah, you can just trust me. Right? So when you look at richness, so that's just a count of the number of species. Of native species, you're seeing a really similar pattern where human impact, the more human impacted environment it is, you see a slight decline in the richness, but really it's a huge difference that comes in those plots that do and do not have jumping worms. And of those native plants, if you were to pull out a few of the common ones that were resilient in the face of jumping worms, I just found out that this name changed since I worked at this. So it's a bad sign when you're still finishing the project and the name gets changed while it's that's happened in a few papers. So this is a really cool one, Johnny Jumpseed. If you're familiar with it, it has a very interesting strategy where it grows up and it can tip over, and then that stem can then have new shoots coming off of it. And so it is totally fine falling over. In fact, it's great. It loves falling over. That means that it sort of spread itself around vegetatively. So that seems to do really well with jumping worms. And then our beloved poison ivy is one that also seems to do okay. Not amazing, not as well as the Johnny Jumpseed. It still sees a bit of a hit, but it's able to, how did you describe it? It's like a lizard. It's able to go around and find little microhabitats and little pockets that are ideal. And it's not stuck dealing with the soil right underneath its feet. And then some species that were particularly negatively impacted were a lot of your sort of classic understory plants like Solomon seal and Trillium species. And a lot of those things that I mentioned at the beginning are warehouses for mycorrhizal fungi. Like if you look at the roots, really, it's crazy that these can sustain that whole big plant, right? But it's because they just have such a big mycorrhizal association. And jumping worms, in particular, are very destructive to that relationship by eating the fungal hyphae, but even more by like jostling it about and having this drying out conditions. All right, so we just took a observational look, first look, that data that they collected, they just so happened to collect the worm data. They weren't doing it as part of the experiment. But then I went and did some other experiments to look at it more precisely and to look at it with multiple stressors, because forests, of course, are not experiencing only one thing. So we've got white-tailed deer that we know are preferentially going after the most palatable species. We've also got invasive plants that we know are competing with native plants. And so you are here growing in the forest in your duff layer, your Solomon seal, and historically you get browsed on by a deer. And maybe what you're going to do is reabsorb your above ground tissue and just go dormant for the rest of the year. Try it again next year and come up. But if that duff layer is gone, your roots and your below ground structures are really stressed out, then you can't rely on that strategy as your plan B. And at the same time, you're in competition with the stilt grass that's coming in and encroaching on your space. So that's the question that motivates a lot of my research is what happens not when you just have one of these things, because forests, what I found, can be quite resilient to one or two things, but it's when you pile this up with climate change and with all of the other things, forest pests, that's where you get a big collapse. And so I think that a great example of this is from two field sites that have really, this is from New York City, that have two really similar overstory compositions of tree species and similar light levels in the understory too. So in this case, it's, and they're really like quite close to each other as well in space. But the one on the right has a huge deer population. Stilt grass, though, you know, the stilt grass is kind of not super abundant. And lots of jumping worms versus here, invasive plants, sure, but not much in the way of deer and no jumping worms. And so, yeah, what the research that I like to do asks the question, why do these two forests look so different? And are there levers that you can pull to try and get this one over here to look a little bit more like this one over here? So yeah, the multiple stressors approach. Lots of deer disclosures. In my PhD, I built a lot of deer disclosures. That's really hard. And so now I find other people's deer disclosures that they've already built. Or in New York City, there's this wonderful extreme abundance gradient of deer where Staten Island is completely covered in deer in some of the further areas, but Central Park has seen one deer in the last 115 years. So that's quite a nice experimental test, because there are some issues with fences, also some experimental issues. And then what I do is sentinel planting. So I grew up on a farm, right? And I love the husbandry of growing plants from Bill's book. Got a lot of my recipes from there, I guess. So germinating different seedlings and then planting them out into these different plots that have the different stressors in combination. And what's nice about that approach is we can work with the managers and base those species based on what they care about most. So in the Northern Forest, we're working with tree seedlings. And then in the Catskills, where they care a little bit less about, hardwoods or timber species, we can use a big diversity of different understory plants that we want to work with. And they care more about the water quality and sort of the whole ecosystem health rather than the timber species. All right, so another graph. Now we're going to look at zigzag goldenrod, Solidago native goldenrod species that we planted out. And so at the top, that's 100% of the individuals that we planted surviving, and down here is 0%. And then along the x-axis, that's the cover of stilt grass. And then the different colored lines are going to be the different levels of jumping worms. So the more yellow, and this is true throughout the whole talk, the more yellow, the more jumping worms. So the middle line, that's the model, and then the other two lines is the confidence interval. Anyway, so what you can see with that black line is you can have a total field of stiltgrass and the goldenrod still survives as long as there are no jumping worms. But and the same is also true if you have jumping worms up here, but no stiltgrass. But it's when you have them in combination that we lose all of the plants at that site. And then, you know, small amount of jumping worms, sort of a middle pattern. And then similarly, when you look at deer, now this is working with false Solomon seal. And now the jumping worms are on the x-axis and the deer are the different colors. And so really similar thing. You can withstand the deer as long as there are no jumping worms. Those are probably not really long-term viable populations because they're hanging out as these little 1 or 2 individuals kind of below the browse line. As Don Waller would say, the molar zone, below the molar zone. Right, so then, and if you have lots of jumping worms, you need to have no deer for the plants to survive. This one is actually a little bit different. This was not ones that we planted out. This was tracking a wild population. So this down here is not disappearance of the plants that I planted. This is disappearance of the native vegetation that was there, tracking it over time, over 3 years. And that persisted, the loss of them at those sites persisted for the last 3 years. So they're probably gone. All right, so jumping worms have the greatest negative effect in combination with the other. You just have the one thing, you're probably okay. So it might not surprise you that as the jumping worms are modifying the native and the invasive plant communities, you see these trickle down effects to ground nesting birds and salamanders, both from the plant side of things, but also I focused on how they've changed the plants, but one of the easiest, most predictable signals that you see that is not hard and complicated to explain is the loss of the native understory food web when jumping worms come in. That's reliable, doesn't matter what the habitat, what the parent material, what the whatever, you always lose the millipedes and the springtails and the mites, especially the mites, when jumping worms come in. And so for a lot of animals, instead of having this smorgasbord across the season, that there's different things coming in, that they're tied to phenologically, it's just one food source all at once, busts, booms, and then busts. So it's really not ideal for their diets. And they also, I'm not going to get into this too much, but they also can bioaccumulate heavy metals. And they're just not as nutritious as the native species. Beyond that, so economic impacts to forest regeneration. Golf courses have been fighting against earthworms since before it was something that anyone interested in conservation cared about. So they have really interesting experiments going back to some pretty unethical chemical applications, but they've done it. So the literature's out there. In Connecticut, the mulch business is actually pretty big. And since that's the number 1 way jumping worms are spread, I've been called a conspiracy theorist in a mulch magazine before. I found the aggregates also, like we mentioned, erode easily, get stuck into drainage and affect drainage in agricultural fields and wash away culverts. Farms, of course, that's my dad. And a big one is plant sales. A lot of people, if they know the community has jumping worms, they emailed me and said, what can we do? Can we still host this? And at first, a lot of the people I talked to stopped it. But actually, if you put a little bit of thought into it, you can still do it pretty easily. So I'm going to talk about what that looks like a little bit later on. Also, so a big one is trails and erosion. This is from a New York City park. Those used to be steps. No, they are not. People send me the craziest pictures, like this one that is a person that is convinced that the jumping worms are eating the cement from this retaining wall that they have. I'm pretty sure I've seen it at my house as well. Yeah, crazy things. Not related to jumping worms, but someone sent me a picture of an earthworm on their third story of their house that had climbed up stucco. All right, so how to identify them? Some of you have seen them, some of them maybe haven't. In summer, very easy to identify. You don't even have to get your hand lens out. But at this time of the year, because they're annuals, you probably aren't going to see them. You probably aren't going to see the cocoons. So what you can instead look for is that really grainy coffee ground soil. To tell them apart from the nightcrawler. So again, nightcrawler on the right, jumping worm on the left. They both can be pigmented, kind of purple, kind of metallic and sheeny, though the jumping worm is really, really metallic and sheeny. When they're mature, you can look at the position of the clitellum. So in the jumping worm, it's quite close to the nose, whereas in the lumbricid European species, it's much closer to the middle of the worm. Oh, and then one that is pretty easy to tell the European worm, regardless of if it's mature or not, is that it gets this beaver tail. If you look at the tail, it's quite flattened, and that helps it move along. So if it's alive, you can see the beaver tail. A little bit more about the clitellum. So that's this band here that is kind of the go-to thing that earthworm ecologists or earthworm scientists use to identify the worms. So in the jumping worms, it's ring-like, so it goes all the way around, kind of like a dog with the, it's like it's the same all the way around, a little bit beyond the body, but yeah. And then in the European lumbricid earthworms, it's like a saddle, so it's on the back of the worm, and it tends to be segmented. So whereas this is just one band, and it's usually brown or dark red, versus the jumping worm one that's kind of mother of pearl, something that you could imagine the shell if you opened up a shell and you looked at the color or saddle. And then since you all have your hand lenses when you go out, I put in this slide too. Their setae is a really good way to identify them without the clitellum. So you can see this with a hand lens. In the jumping worm, it's this ring-like setae around the body of the worm. And then in the European species, they tend to be paired. And there's just fewer of them, and they're bigger, and they're kind of more pronounced. All right, so soil, that's easy all year round. And worms kind of appear and disappear. So really, the soil is the most reliable way. The thrashing behavior, the really high abundance, the setae, or the ring-like dog in an inner tube clitellum close to the head of the worm. All right, so tips to stop the spread. The hopeful part of this that gets me through the day is thinking about other invasive species. So chestnut blight that also showed up at the Bronx Zoo about 30 years before jumping worms did. That showed up in North America, and 10 years, it had really done a number on the whole place. Doesn't matter what we did. It spread without us once it got here. Emerald ash borer is kind of in the middle, where it relied on us to hitchhike. It does some moving of its own. But some of our actions that we took really slowed it down. And I heard a rumor that they're identifying some resistant ones, maybe in the Midwest. Anyone else heard that rumor?
Is resistant, the borer or the tree?
The tree. But yeah, so slowing that insect down, changing our behaviors had a big impact, potentially. Again, haven't looked it up myself. Someone just said that I caught top of mind. I meant to look it up. But jumping worms are on the far extreme where they're very destructive. They really don't move very much on their own. It's really us moving them through mulch and through soil. And so the hopeful part of that is that changing some of our behaviors can really make a big difference. And often if you can slow down that invasion, then the ecosystem comes up with something. Jumping worms are extremely genetically not diverse. Remember I mentioned they're parthenogenetic. So in the Finger Lakes where we have an experiment to look at the genetics on two different sides of the gorge, it's all just exactly identical worms on one side, and the other side is a different worm and entirely identical. All of the different worms. There's one that made the move, but for the most part, like the 50 worms that we have from both sides are both really inbred. So they don't have a lot of genetic diversity. So maybe in the long run, slow them down. Nature will find a way. So other ways to slow them down, planting bare root. This has got other great reasons to do it as well. But you can rinse the roots and visually inspect them. It's not like it needs to be totally disinfected from worms. Their eggs are visible to the human eye, and they look like about the size of like a slow release fertilizer pellet. So as long as you don't have big clumps of soil, pretty good, or mulch. Making sure that your bait or compost are right worms. And then a big place that I've seen them coming into natural areas is from yard waste being dumped alongside roads or into natural areas. And then that's my mom. Shopping local and communicating that this is a priority to landscaping businesses, to nurseries, etc. So plant sales. I said I was going to mention what to do about plant sales. So the nice thing about plant sales, do you guys do anything like that? Some folks do. But this is also true for sharing plants or collecting plants or any kind of, digging plants out of a place with jumping worms. So you can rinse the plants in a fine meshed colander. You plop the plant into there, and then all of the water that's coming out, that's fine. You can just throw that away. And then all of the solids, you just collect that. You can heat it or dispose of it in ethanol or vinegar. And then, the liquid is safe to dump. And then from there, you can either plant bare root, or you can repot them into a worm-free soil or soilless media. These really dense bricks of pro-mix that are kept indoors that don't have any holes in them, that aren't left out in the rain. I've never seen a worm in these, so these seem like a good place to repot into. And then mulch is another big one. So if you're bringing in mulch, heating it, it doesn't need to be too hot, just 104 Fahrenheit. So really, like, if you get mulch in the middle of the summer, can you bag it up, leave it in the hot car for a few days, carry it around in the trunk, or spread it out in a thin layer and put some plastic over top of it, create a little mini greenhouse, and heat it up. Technically, mulch that's sold should be heat treated and compost, but it may have been heat treated and then sat around in a pile that jumping worms could then come back into. Better still, making your own mulch and compost. It can be free or low cost from tree removal businesses. I flagged down the electrical company when they do their laps of cutting trees, and then they can give me the mulch just from my street. But thinking about the supply chain of where these come from. Another place that we see jumping worms come in that's like not the top things of mulch, but in the treads of tires. People say the treads of boots, but I'm like, I really don't think that that's a big way. But if you've got any contracts for logging or landscaping, putting in a provision that material being, equipment's being sprayed down in between jobs. And that's also a great way to keep out other pests and invasive seeds. And NASMA, North American Invasive Species Management Association, maybe, have a little bit of information on their website about these contracts and sort of some language you can use for that if you want. And if bare root isn't an option, just doing a visual inspection of the plants. So popping them out of the pack, an uninfested, it'll look like soil, but especially perennials, if it's pretty easy to check if they have jumping worms because you'll look and see that the castings right on the top of the pot. Okay, so a hopeful story. Remember I said that the Bronx Zoo was a place that the jumping worms were introduced in the 1940s. So right next to that 14 million people a year go from the zoo to this forest. And they have almost no jumping worms. They've got a deep organic horizon. It's right next door, the Thane family forest. So this was a real head scratcher. Like how have jumping worms not made that move? It's not that far. Unfortunately, they do all of the things right that I would say. So I don't know which of these is the most important, but it's old growth, so they haven't had lots of equipment in there. They make their own mulch, they propagate the plants on site, or use bare root seedlings, and they have deer excluded from the property. So managing the supply chain of the mulch and the soil and the plants, and managing some of the other things. I didn't also say this, but they have a ton of volunteers pulling the invasive plants too. Yeah, and managing the forest can really be helpful. Okay, so whose favorite forest or favorite site, favorite garden does have jumping worms now? Yeah, okay, all right. So we got some existential battles. Once you have them, what can you do? So managing for sprouts and forest regeneration, jumping worms are all in that top layer. So if you can manage these sprouts instead of relying on new regeneration, that's going to help at least for a generation or two. Experimenting with ground covers and other creeping native species be a good option. Poison ivy. I wish people would garden with it. It's so good for wildlife. It's beautiful in the fall, but it's not really a hit in my suburban neighborhood. But things that maybe have a similar growth habit to poison ivy might be a place to be thinking. And then thinking about deep-rooted species. So you can either plant bigger species, like some of those tree seedlings that I showed that were 2 or 3 years old. They seem to be doing okay with the jumping worms. We're not seeing that precipitous drop off like with the herbaceous ones that I talked about. So if you can plant bigger, if you can plant things with deeper roots, pollinator gardens with those very, a lot of the species that are in pollinator gardens, the root architecture, the root traits seem to be, I don't know exactly what it is about it. I think it's probably like the physical structure of it. It's very matted and thick. Seems to both repel jumping worms and reduce them once it's restored with these species. I haven't done any experiments on this, so this is more anecdotal, but I'm fairly confident in that. Right, so restoration, reforestation, protecting from deer, selecting larger seedlings with more developed roots, planting earlier in the spring or later in the fall when jumping worms aren't around and causing the most trouble, right? They're annual species, so July, August, not that you're going to be planting too much in July and August, but you never know. Additional watering, so they dry out quickly, so maybe you need to modify things a little bit, and then managing invasive plants can help too. And I'm trying to work to get some traits of species that are good to plant if you have jumping worms, but I'm still working on that. There's some interesting management research that's going on from some collaborators. So physical disruption of jumping worms. Heat seems pretty effective. So either like if you have beds and annuals covering it and making like a little mini greenhouse. And then the Regional Water Authority in Connecticut just bought a seed steamer to deal with invasive plants in ditches, but that's also really where jumping worms are spreading too, and they're quite sensitive to heat. So I'm going to work with them. I feel pretty excited about that steamer strategy. And then this is an old picture from a golf course. Some of the chemical things that they were doing. There's more interesting, less destructive chemical strategies that people are thinking about. So Vera Krischik at University of Minnesota has an interesting project going on looking at tea seed meal, so saponins. It's like on quinoa, right? When you rinse it, there's that bubbly sort of detergent-like substance. So it is organic, and it's currently for sale for soil supplementing, but not for pesticide use. So this is off-label use, and I wouldn't recommend it because we really haven't tested to see what the other downstream effects are. There are a lot of other things out there that have mucous membranes, that, you know, salamanders and those native earthworms that I mentioned right at the top. So I'm not ready to recommend this before do the cost benefit analysis of it's organic, but it has consequences. How do those consequences line up against the worms themselves? And it's probably never going to, I mean, certainly never going to be a strategy for a whole forest. Maybe a strategy for like garden in the woods, you know, plantings, or for beds or something like that. But anyway, she's working on this. She is driving things along. And so hopefully we're both part of this Healthy Soil Collaborative. That's a group of people working on jumping worms. All right, so a few takeaways. Jumping worms impacting native plants. The greatest impacts, though, are in forests with multiple stressors. Invasive plants, deer, other stressors, likely as well. Worms may disappear, especially at this time of year, but those if you're going to do one thing to limit the spread, it's think about contaminated soil and mulch, really of any kind, trying to not move mulch very much. And then you can mitigate the impact with management of other stressors, site prep, like with heat, and selecting larger, deeper rooted species to plant. So that Healthy Soil Collaborative, this is a little bit more information that we have on that site. We're building it up and building it up, but yeah, that's where I'm going to leave it, and I think we got some time for questions.
We know that in sort of deciduous forest ecosystems, that ants are really important to seed dispersal and other things with these forest ephemerals. Do we know how jumping worms affect ants?
There is a
Question,
rest.
How do jumping worms interact with ants?
Yeah. So that was actually one thing I was hoping someone would bring up on that first. What are your favorite plants? Right. So we actually have a study that is pretty near finished that includes that. So we collected all sorts of forest floor samples and looked at the ant community in that. There's a grad student working on it. And I think, okay, I've seen preliminary data. I shouldn't speculate. I don't really remember what it is. So it's coming out of the University of Vermont. So it will be coming out soon. I think she's working on it. But I'm pretty sure there was a pretty strong signal in ants. And I think that is like a really, really rich question that people me, others, people have got to look at. So that I think is really important. And it tracks with a lot of the species that you see disappearing. Great question. Yeah.
So we know they don't really tolerate heat all too well. Are they established? And if they are, what are the out of the tropics?
Right. So the question was, if they don't like heat too much, what are they looking like in the south? So, they the worms create this, like I said, they engineer their habitat to be really nice for themselves, this castings. And so if it's just about day temperature and they have built up their castings, no problem. It's nice and buffered down there at the bottom of their castings. So they don't really mind air temperature if they can doodle down. But they don't seem to be quite as much of a problem in south. And part of that could be all the way back to the beginning. There are more native earthworms in the south. So I think that one of the reasons why they're so invasive up here is it's a really empty niche. In their own native habitat, these worms are outcompeted by other megasclecids, so other things in that family, and they only exist in ditches. So they seem to be a little bit less, but there's other reasons they could be less abundant in the south. More fire. Fire seems to be pretty good at suppressing them also. So if prescribed burns are happening, that can be really good too. But yeah, so climate change probably not gonna solve it. Probably not the reason they're less abundant down south. But yeah, they're kind of like humans where they can re-engineer things to be just rosy for themselves. All right, you were next.
They have like low temperature sensitivities.
So the question was, do they have low temperature sensitivities? And they do. And that is 5 degrees Celsius in the lab, is when they start to kind of trail off. But as you get into October, they really slow down and you poke them and they don't really jump anymore. So I think it's a slow decline. But their cocoons are very resilient to cold. Took a picture out, but was it you that was saying your Canadian citizenship? Did I hear that? So there's a Canadian scientist that mapped out where in Canada they could go to, and like north of almost up to Churchill, Manitoba, like up way up, given modeling based on lab temperatures. So, whatever.
Huh.
Cold, climate change, yeah, climate extremes, probably not gonna stop them. I think, yeah, okay, why don't you go ahead?
And so I guess one thing is like when you look at these worms, right? Like they're very different from any other worm in North America. Like they're megascolecids, and I think there's not really any native megascolecids in North America.
Right.
They're mostly restricted to Asia. Yeah, and it's interesting. So it's like they just have so many like characteristics, like just like the way they feel, their texture, the way their predators have trouble eating them compared to both like the native like Diplocardia or like the introduced like lumbricids. Like I wonder if that makes them like a really good potential candidate for biocontrol. Because what if there's some like parasitoid insect or something in the native range?
Okay, so the question was, they seem like they could be really good biocontrol candidates because they've got some good strategies for getting around predators. Okay, so they actually have a ton of parasites already, and that is probably part of why they're parthenogenetic, is that the male sex organs are targeted by some of these parasites. Other parasites doing other things, but they're kind of like big parasite factories. So they do have parasites, and they do have predators. I have a Google alert for the scientific name. So anytime it shows up in like a master's student bluebird gut, thesis, I get the ping. So I see them pinging up in all of these places as being eaten. Moles eat them. So I think it's not a lack of predators or a lack of parasites that is making them invasive. I think it's more bottom up or competition, that they lack competition. But certainly anyway, so I don't, it's not like nothing eats them, right? There's all sorts of different ways to be invasive, to become invasive, and escaping predators is only one of them. So I think that it's not going to probably solve it, but there is a little bit of work going on with like a fungus that you can buy over, just use off label, just like the other one that I mentioned. So people are looking into that a little bit, but I'm not waiting for that to be the magic bullet. But again, no genetic diversity, so maybe you can get just one parasite.
Well, there's like a fly that'll eat them that won't eat other, other insects that just haven't been discovered.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so keep your eyes and ears to the ground, but that would be very nice. But yeah, there are things that do eat them kind of now.
Question from the chat, I think.
Have any longitudinal studies been done? Anecdotally, I hear of gardens being impacted for a few years and then jumping worms are no longer detected.
So people do sometimes say that, but I think that for the most part, what I've seen, I'm not saying it's not possible, but that there'll be like a couple of dry years and then they won't be very visible. And so people will think they're gone, but then you get a wet year and then they're right back. But again, the lack of genetic diversity, I'm really banking on the fact that they are going to do something to get wiped out, had to have a boom and bust from a site. So that would be, if somebody has really reliable knowledge of that, that would be great. But in every instance that I've heard of, they do come back once you get a wet year.
And then another question, have you seen the ground covered in pine needles is less hospitable?
Less hospitable, yes, but not unhospitable. So like the Cornell Botanical Gardens, they actually are the ones that first got me into jumping worms because they wanted someone to talk about it. And I was like, I don't study these. They're like, but nobody does. You can look it up. You can come talk to us. So they are the ones that got me on this train. But they use a lot of pine mulch and they've got a robust community of jumping worms. Like maybe it's like 50 instead of 200 per square meter. There's less, but it does not stop them.
And then the very last question,
But wait, it does stop them. That really toxic mulch, the black, you know what I'm talking about, or the red, like plastic mulch.
Oh.
Never seen a jumping worm under that.
And then the last question, I'm going to combine, there's several folks who are curious about steam treating.
Mhm.
So, best times of years, do the cocoons persist? Anything you can elaborate
Actually,
on?
that's an extremely important. So both for steam and for if you're in an area where prescribed burn is reasonable, then timing is everything. So what you need to not do is time it when they're adults that can dive down and disappear into the lower depths because they're pretty fast at moving through. So you got to time it at either the beginning or the end of the season, like late October or before May, maybe, so that you can get the cocoons. So those are what you want to steam, or the really, really young juveniles. But the adults can kind of, at least for prescribed burns, and then probably also for steam, but I haven't seen the research on that. Prescribed burns, if you get them when they're older, it's much less effective. Yeah.
Great question. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Dobson.